The mind forms impressions quickly, often within seconds. A person walks into the room. They speak for a moment. You notice their posture, their tone, their expression. The brain begins organizing these signals immediately. Before you consciously decide anything, you feel that they seem confident, or distant, or arrogant, or trustworthy. The conclusion forms quickly. It rarely feels like a conclusion. It feels like perception, as if you simply noticed something obvious. But the brain is doing something more complicated. It is building a first explanation of the person, based on very little information, a few signals, a few behaviors, a few seconds of observation. From those fragments, the mind constructs a coherent image, a mental outline of who the person might be. This process happens rapidly because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. The brain prefers clarity, even when the clarity is incomplete. A quick judgment reduces ambiguity. You feel like you understand the person. You feel oriented in the interaction. But the impression did not come from careful observation. It came from interpretation. The mind compared the signals it noticed to patterns it already knows. A confident posture may resemble someone you trusted before. A reserved tone may resemble someone who once rejected you. Past experiences quietly influence the judgment. The mind asks an invisible question. What does this remind me of? The answer shapes the impression. Confidence becomes competence. Quietness becomes distance. Directness becomes arrogance. The interpretation feels immediate, and once it appears, the mind holds on to it. Because the first explanation becomes the starting point for everything that follows. The initial judgment becomes an anchor, an invisible reference point. Every later behavior begins relating to that first conclusion. New signals are interpreted through it. New information is measured against it. The anchor quietly organizes perception. From that moment forward, you rarely observe the person without the influence of that first impression. Because the mind already believes it understands who they are, even when the interaction has only just begun. If this perspective resonates, like the video. Subscribe if you want more. No pressure, just awareness. Once the first impression forms, the mind begins organizing everything around it. Not deliberately, structurally. The initial judgment becomes a reference point, a quiet anchor in perception. Every new signal begins relating to that anchor. If the first impression suggested confidence, later behaviors begin looking competent. If the first impression suggested arrogance, the same behaviors begin looking self-important. If the first impression suggested warmth, silence begins looking thoughtful. The same actions can be interpreted in completely different ways. The difference is not the behavior, it is the anchor. The mind uses the first impression as a starting explanation. Everything afterward becomes supporting material. Signals that match the impression stand out immediately. Signals that contradict it become harder to notice. Not because they disappear, because attention quietly moves away from them. The brain prefers consistency. A stable interpretation feels comfortable. Contradictory information introduces uncertainty again. And uncertainty is what the first impression was meant to resolve. So the mind protects the anchor, often without realizing it. Details that support the impression feel important. Details that challenge it feel less convincing. Gradually, a narrative begins forming. You begin telling yourself who the person is. They are confident. They are careless. They are intelligent. They are difficult. The story becomes stable. And once the story stabilizes, it begins guiding perception automatically. When the person speaks, you listen through the story. When they react, you interpret through the story. The anchor quietly filters everything. This process is known as anchoring. The first piece of information becomes disproportionately influential, even when it was based on very little evidence. The mind treats the initial judgment as a foundation, a starting truth. Later information becomes adjustment, small corrections around the original conclusion, rarely a complete reconsideration, which means the first impression quietly controls the interpretation of everything that follows. The anchor remains in place, even when the person reveals qualities that contradict it, even when new evidence appears, even when the situation changes. Because once the mind believes it understands someone, it becomes very skilled at protecting that belief, and the first impression continues shaping perception long after the first moment has passed. The first impression rarely disappears, but it can loosen. The anchor becomes powerful because it goes unnoticed. It quietly shapes interpretation. It guides attention. It filters what feels meaningful. Most of the time, the mind never questions it. It simply continues building the story. But the moment you notice the anchor, the process begins changing. Awareness introduces distance. Instead of immediately trusting the interpretation, you begin observing it. You notice the original judgment. You notice how quickly it appeared. And you notice how everything afterward seems connected to it. A question begins forming. Am I seeing the person or the first impression? That question weakens the anchor. It creates space between observation and interpretation. You begin noticing behaviors that the first impression ignored. Moments of patience, moments of hesitation, moments that do not fit the story. The person becomes less predictable, less defined by the first moment you saw them, more complex. Observation slowly replaces assumption. Instead of protecting the first judgment, the mind becomes curious about what it missed. The anchor loosens, and perception becomes more flexible. The person in front of you begins separating from the version your mind created earlier, not because the first impression was completely wrong, but because it was incomplete. A fragment, not a full picture. Every person reveals themselves slowly, across many moments, across many interactions. But the mind prefers quick conclusions, which is why the first impression feels so convincing. It arrives early, and the mind begins trusting it immediately. Awareness interrupts that trust, not by removing impressions, but by recognizing how easily they become anchors. If this perspective resonated, consider liking the video and subscribing, not to eliminate first impressions, but to notice how quietly they begin shaping everything that follows.